Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today for this edition of the IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me introduce you to IRENA and to our webinar series. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 163 member countries. We welcome Austria in the beginning of the year, and there are another 21 countries in their accession process. We support these countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation as a center of excellence and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Since our analytical work and our engagement with our member countries generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that is why we launched our fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program back in January 2020, so before the pandemic drove the whole proliferation of online events. So every other week, presenters from one of IRENA's team share with you key insights or key findings from their latest work, offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. While there are many other longer deep dive webinars out there, here we aim to keep webinars short. So they last approximately 30 minutes, so we cannot cover everything. But the idea is to give you enough to decide whether you want to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentation further sources of more in-depth information to help you do that. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is titled Renewables and Energy Efficiency Addressing the Rising Energy Usage of Cryptocurrency Mining. There are ongoing debates around the energy usage for cryptocurrency mining, and today's webinar will bring you a bit of clarity on that and also on the role of renewables and energy efficiency in this debate. It is a timely topic and it will be presented by Mr. Francisco Boschel and Mr. Sean Radka, who are IRENA's experts on digitalization. Their presentation will last approximately 20 minutes to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over the microphone to Francisco and Sean, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is recorded, as usually, and it will be available together with the presentation slides on IRENA's webinar website under past webinars. We will share with you the link to the website also in our follow-up email, which you will receive within 14 hours after the webinar. And just for your information, all previous webinar recordings and slides are already on the website. All of you are currently muted and you will remain so throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have any questions to our speakers, please send it to us through the question feature, which you can find on the webinar panel. We are monitoring your questions throughout the session and we will select some to be answered by our speakers. But due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. And to be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinars and ways to improve it, and what else you would like us to cover in our future editions, we would appreciate your feedback. So at the end of the webinar and then again in the follow-up email, we will share with you a link to a very short satisfactory survey, which we invite you to complete. We are monitoring your comments and we work on selecting topics of your interest and trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. And last but not least, if you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option, which is located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And now, without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Francisco and Sean. Francisco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Next slide, please. Well, first of all, I would like to start by giving you a brief introduction to the role of digitalization, but specifically distributed layer technologies in the power sector. Next slide, please. So the ongoing power sector transformation is propelled now by three clear innovation trends. The first one, which is more focused on the supply side, is the decentralization. So we are seeing that thanks to the small scale and modular applications of renewable energy generation technologies, especially rooftop PV systems, plus behind the meter batteries, we are seeing an increased role of small generation units distributed across the power system, instead of having just centralized generation units as we used to have in a conventional power system. Now, the second trend, which is more on the demand side, is to electrify to the possible extent all end-use energy demand sectors. And this is what we are seeing, for example, with electric vehicles, the deployment of heat pumps, electric boilers, electrolyzers to production of hydrogen, etc. So to replace the direct combustion of fossil fuels by the use of renewable electricity in the end-use sector. Now, both of these trends, the decentralization and electrification, means that we are bringing new assets which are connected to the electricity system from the generation perspective, all these small rooftop PV systems, batteries, etc. And on the demand side, also new loads like electric vehicles, heat pumps, etc. That increased the level of complexity of the power system and how to operate and optimize such a power system. Then is where we see an important role of the third innovation trend, which is digitalization. And basically the role of digitalization in the power sector is to better optimize these more complex systems and integrate all these small generation units on the supply side and new loads on the demand side. Now, the topic that we will be discussing today, which is Bitcoin mining, is supported by a distributed layer technology called blockchain, which is also used for certain applications in the energy sector. Now, next slide, please. And blockchain technology, but basically distributed layer technologies. Next slide, please. But specifically, blockchain technologies are already being used in power systems to benefit from all these distributed energy resources. What we see is that in order to make good use of all these distributed energy resources, we need to make transactions. Transaction means, for example, paying for charging my electric vehicle or doing trade of electricity with my peers in my microgrid, for example, or managing or purchasing or selling renewable energy credits. So all these transactions need now to be secured and to the possible extent to be automated based on certain criteria. And that is where is an interesting role for blockchain, because blockchain can help us to make these transactions more efficient, faster, but also secure, because they are encrypted and they are secure in the blockchain. This is why we think that the main innovation around blockchain is this smart contracts. And now we see that these smart contracts are already being used, supported by blockchain for certain applications, such as peer-to-peer trade of electricity, to better manage the grid system, to charge electromobility, etc. Now, in a recent analysis from BNEF released, I think, a couple of weeks ago, there was an interesting insight. It seems to be that there was a peak in the investments in startups using blockchain in 2018, reaching around $4 billion US. But since then, in the last 2 years, there is a decrease in this level of investments. Now there is, or last year, there was a level of investment of around 2.5 billion US in startups using a blockchain application. Now, in the energy sector, it seems to be that basically peer-to-peer trading is losing momentum. It seems to be that issues around regulation, but also scalability of this application is hampering this kind of application of blockchain in the power system. However, other applications seems to be picking up, particularly the ones related to financial aspects and the ones related to renewable energy certificates. So it seems to be that now there is a movement from peer-to-peer trading more to PPAs, contracts, and managing renewable energy certificates. But it's to be seen how the momentum around blockchain in the power system will continue in the following years. Next slide, please. Now, let me go back to the electrification point once again, because it's quite important in the discussion that we will have today. What we see on the screen is IRENA's scenarios if we want to achieve a 1.5-degree Paris Agreement scenario. And what we see on the left bar is the electricity consumption in 2018, which reached around 22,000 terawatt hours. Now, what we see is that in this 1.5-degree scenario, electricity from renewables should be the main energy carrier. So electricity demand may increase more than 60% by 2030, so reaching around 36,000 terawatt hours, and more than triple by 2050, reaching more than 70,000 terawatt hours. Nowadays, most of the electricity is used in the residential building sector and in industries and commercial sector. However, if we see the electricity consumed in the transport sector in 2018, so the few electric vehicles, but also electric trains and so on, it was around 390 terawatt hours, so more or less 1.8% of total electricity demand. Now, if we compare that with the estimate electricity consumption from data centers in 2018, it was around 200 terawatt hours, so more or less 1% of all electricity consumption in 2018 was going to consumption in data centers. How it may look in 2030? Well, the transport sector, just to have also a comparison here, we expect that this may increase, especially due to the pickup of or takeoff or electric vehicles, may increase to around 3,000 terawatt hours in 2030, so more or less 8% of total electricity demand. And data centers is estimated to grow also quite significantly. There are different studies which put the consumption of data centers in 2030 around 1 to 4,000 terawatt hours by 2030. So it means that it might be between 3 and 11% of total electricity demand. So it means that the consumption of data centers would be quite significant, even possibly in a similar range as electricity consumed in the transport sector. That is why it's so important for us to start looking on how we will manage the electricity demand from data centers and ICT. Next slide, please. And looking at these electricity demands, we have looking from the perspective of the power system and how to integrate more renewables in power system. There are two issues which are particularly important. The first is, of course, the total energy demand in the form of electricity that would come from these new sources. And as said, it might be quite significant. In data centers, maybe around 3 to 8% or 11% of total electricity demand. And of course, the first challenge is that all this additional electricity demand should come from renewables. If we really want to go net zero carbon by mid of this century, all should come from renewables. And the second point, which is more related to the infrastructure, is not only the average electricity demand, but how this electricity would look like on a time scale. So second by second, basically, or the discussion about the peak demand. When we will have higher demand from data centers, when we will have lower demand across the day, because that will set the baseline for the investments needed in electricity grids. Now, this calls for what we call a smart electrification approach. So it means an approach where you take into account the requirements from the demand side, in this case, the data centers, but also the needs from the electricity grid in order not to constrain the electricity grid, but actually use these loads as a source of flexibility that may reduce the investments in infrastructure for the power system. So the question, more than whether these loads will increase, is how we will manage these new loads. We should do it in a smart way, because a dumb electrification approach may result in very significant additional investments. Now, with that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Sean Radka, who will now in a deep dive on the Bitcoin mining electricity demand and how we can make that a smart approach. Sean.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Next slide, please. So thanks, Francisco, for setting the scene and really showing why we're looking at this sector. And I think it's quite an important sector to look at objectively. So as Martina mentioned at the top, there's an ongoing heated debate. You can see some clippings here about the energy use from cryptocurrency mining. Usually it's centered around Bitcoin. It's the most well-known, the oldest blockchain and the largest as well. I think it's about $1 trillion market cap as of today. These articles usually skew either very pro or anti-Bitcoin. So we at Arena wanted to do our own analysis as objective observers and see what's really happening. And after looking at this sector and following the developments for the past 3 or 4 years, we feel the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And what really matters is how we integrate this new energy demand, as Francisco mentioned, in order to accelerate the power sector transition to 100% renewables as quickly as possible, in line with our 1.5C climate goals. And in fact, we issued a report in 2019 on all the use cases of blockchain in the energy sector, which Francisco gave a bit of flavor of it. It's on our website as well. Obviously, a lot has changed because the sector moves very quickly, but we've been looking at this for quite a while. And really, we don't think blockchain should be dismissed. They do offer real value and a myriad of use cases, from simple decentralized value transfer without the need for a trusted intermediary, to the recent explosion of non-fungible tokens or NFTs. And as my colleague Francisco mentioned, our main goal at Arena is really to increase the share of renewables. So we're using this as sort of a tool. And I think it's important that we choose to see this new electricity load not as a threat, but more as an opportunity. And it really depends on us. And we can use it as an opportunity to further add flexibility to our grids, and increase the share of solar and wind even further if we do it in a smart way. And we can do that by learning from similar industries. So I'll talk a bit about that today. Next slide, please. So a bit of background, since I know we have many attendees today with a varying degree of previous knowledge on this topic. We have an article coming out soon in Smart Energy International, which really dives deeply, a bit more technical, but today we'll try to keep it a bit high level just so that everyone can follow. But there are many types of blockchains and many diverse means of reaching consensus. Bitcoin is simply one application of distributed ledger technology or blockchain. As I mentioned, it's the largest. It has about $1 trillion market cap. Ether or Ethereum is second at 300 billion, and they're the two most used chains. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And we'll mainly be talking about proof of work mining, as it's by far the most energy intensive. And the underlying principles do apply to other chains as well. So another point to note is that both Ethereum and Bitcoin are public permissionless blockchains, meaning that anyone can see what's happening on the network and anyone can participate. This distinguishes them from other more closed blockchains, which can boast higher transactions per second or more energy efficiency due to their centralized nature. So they're essentially just centralized databases. So what we're really focusing on are the really tough to decarbonize, open permissionless proof of work blockchains. And one important thing to note here is that Ethereum has already a roadmap to transition to proof of stake. Some of you might be screaming at the screen that they are decarbonizing, and we're aware of that. And they are set to reduce their energy consumption by about 99% once that happens within the next year or two. So yes, next slide, please. So proof of work mining keeps the network secure, but requires vast amounts of electricity to power the miners. You can see on the screen. This is an Antminer S19. It's one of the newest, and it uses about 3,200 watts of power. For comparison, the notebook computer you're likely on right now watching this webinar uses about 50 watts. So they're quite energy intensive. Next slide, please. So what does this all add up to? Basically, Cambridge's Center for Alternative Finance estimates the Bitcoin network's current annualized electricity consumption totals about 110 terawatt hours. Distributed among miners globally. And this accounts for about 0.5% of total global electricity consumption. So it's quite substantial. This would rank in the top 30 electricity consumers worldwide if it were a country. I should note that these estimates do vary based on source. So these figures should be taken with a grain of salt. However, Another major source of data has the Bitcoin network's annualized energy consumption at about 100 terawatt hours. So likely this is quite accurate. For comparison, home video game systems use about 34 terawatt hours per year out of the total 20,000 terawatt hours that Francisco discussed. So because of all the uncertainty in terms of gauging how much energy usage there is, it's extremely difficult to predict future energy consumption from proof of work chains like Bitcoin. You would first need to be able to predict the price of Bitcoin. And if you can do that, please reach out to us and let us know what your thoughts are about the future. I'd be happy to talk to you. Also, as layer 2 solutions are developed, the energy consumption of these chains may also decrease. And that's something I'll talk a bit about. Just one mention, since the next slide will be about the price. I just wanted to mention yesterday, it cost about $45 million to secure the Bitcoin network, which was paid out to miners powering these mining rigs that I showed you in the last slide. And that's about $17 billion annually. So there's a lot of money going in to secure this network, and it costs a lot of electricity. Next slide, please. So here you can see a bit of the correlation between the Bitcoin price and the energy usage on the prior slide. So typically these two move in tandem. A lot of times the price may dictate the hash rate. If the price of Bitcoin goes up very quickly, because Elon Musk tweets something, then the hash rate will also follow quickly because it becomes more economical for the less efficient miners to then join the network and start mining Bitcoin. Next slide, please. So I mentioned Ethereum earlier. So about 1/3 of Bitcoin's energy consumption you can see here in terms of Ethereum. So it's still substantial. Again, we're not as worried about the loads from Ethereum because it already does have a pathway to transition to proof of stake, which I'll talk about a bit later within the next year or so, which should decarbonize the chain by about 99%. And where we're seeing the most development really is on Ethereum in terms of these layer 2 solutions and a lot of what Francisco mentioned in terms of renewable energy credits. Peer-to-peer power trading is happening on the Ethereum blockchain. So this makes us optimistic for the future that we're seeing so much open source development happening on the chain that really will be nearly carbon neutral or much more energy efficient than it is today, I should say. Next slide, please. So for Bitcoin, which will continue to use energy-intensive proof of work for the foreseeable future, what we need to do is ensure that the power they consume is renewable. So the economics of renewables are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us. Renewable energy costs declined rapidly over the past decade, and they're increasingly the cheapest source of power anywhere. According to Cambridge, on average, 39% of proof of work mining is powered by renewable energy, primarily hydroelectric power. And this is higher than the 25% global average share of renewables in electricity generation in 2019. So we already do see a higher share of renewables within proof of work mining than we do on average. With electricity as the main operational cost for miners, essentially there's fierce competition to find the cheapest sources of power, making low-cost renewable electricity, which has declined sharply, the most attractive option. So in fact, more than half of the renewable capacity added in 2019 achieved lower costs than new coal. So really, this is an attractive opportunity, even if you don't consider carbon emissions and all that. It still makes sense to use renewables, even without considering the externalities. And one question we like to discuss in the office is, as the cost of renewables continue to fall, will these proof of work miners follow historical precedents whereby energy-intensive commodities were used to export energy? If you think of aluminum smelting in Iceland and more recently strategically located data centers in cold areas and locations with abundant underutilized renewable electricity. So will we see increasingly geographical centralization of Bitcoin mining to areas with cheapest source of power and coldest climates used for cooling? It's an interesting thing that we'd like to talk about. Next slide, please. So renewables present challenges in terms of matching peak load with peak demand. Again, as my colleague discussed, in essence, the sun shines during the day, but not at night. Wind is more unpredictable. but tends to blow more heavily at night. What this means is that renewable power supply can vary substantially. So power demand, however, peaks around the late afternoon or early evening when people arrive home or turn on appliances, at which time neither solar nor wind are available. So the end result is significantly more power than society typically needs, a few hours per day, and not nearly enough at other times. Proof of work mining can help flatten this curve if done smartly and reduce curtailment among solar and wind assets when demand for power is low. Basically, proof of work miners are unique energy buyers in that they offer highly flexible and easily interruptible loads, provide payout in a globally liquid cryptocurrency, and are completely location agnostic. They only require an internet connection. These combined qualities make it an energy buyer of last resort, which can be turned off or on at a moment's notice based on price signals for power. So if there's too much solar or wind coming online, the price of electricity can fall accordingly, and suddenly it makes economic sense for miners to switch on their rigs, thereby helping to flatten the curve and make grids a bit more secure. So this cheap power can also be used to fill batteries for later use as well. A point we keep coming to on our team is that the rising energy demand proof of work mining isn't inherently bad or good, but rather it really depends on how we integrate these additional loads. We need to be strategic. So similar to our work on electric vehicles, we show that added demand for electricity can be a blessing or a curse for grids based on how we proceed. By charging smartly, EVs can provide grid services and add flexibility to power systems, but they can also produce strain on grids if we don't do it in a smart way, and we see similar things for this additional load from IT infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we've been studying data centers in specific to see what innovations can be applied to other power-hungry sectors, and some key learnings which apply are listed here. So essentially, locating data centers in locations with abundant and cheap renewable electricity and with colder climates where power needed for cooling is minimized. The top right photo is a Facebook data center in Sweden, which uses power for electricity and passive cooling via outside air to reduce their energy needs. Also enabling data centers, and again, all of this we think in the future could be applied to large mining centers, but also enabling data centers to provide services in power flexibility markets through intelligent load shifting and battery storage. In Belgium, for example, Google is now installing the first ever battery-based system for replacing generators at hyperscale data centers. That's the bottom right photo. On the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about their carbon intelligent computing platform. So I'll hold off on that. But the next photo, leveraging sector coupling, including supplying local district heating systems with waste heat. You can see some of these pipes in the middle. Basically, there's an example from Facebook that I'll cover soon. And then lastly, the use of machine learning to optimize operations and increase energy efficiency, largely via intelligent cooling. Next slide, please. So this slide might take a while to load, but it should show you the dynamic changes. Here we have an example of what price signals can achieve based on what Google is testing at their data centers to increase the share of renewables in their consumption. So basically what you can see is that the compute loads can be aligned with low carbon energy. They can increase their demand when the share of renewables is high and decrease it when it is low. So there's lots of things like this being tested, and it uses a lot of machine learning, and perhaps we can integrate some of these things with proof of work mining as well, since it is such a digitized sector. Next slide, please. So here we have an example from Facebook data centers where, rather than releasing the warm air from servers into the atmosphere, this facility directs it across copper coils filled with water. The process starts with district heating operator running water from its new pump facility directly to the data center, where the water is heated inside copper coils and then sent back to be used as district heating. So things like this are quite interesting, and this one here produces up to 25 megawatts per hour of usable heat. So really nothing is wasted when you're using renewables to power the servers, and then you're using the waste heat to power water for nearby homes. Next slide, please. So there's just one more slide after this, and we can get to the questions, I promise. I mentioned earlier that there are other means of reaching consensus, and it's worth a quick slide explaining this just a bit, since it means that the second largest blockchain, Ethereum, which continues to grow, will become about 99% more energy efficient. So despite the high energy needs of proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin or Ethereum, newer consensus mechanisms, including proof of stake, which eliminate the need for mining, are being developed and implemented. Also, we're seeing promising layer 2 solutions being built on top of the two largest chains in order to reduce energy usage and transaction fees for network participants, essentially by batching large volumes of transactions on layer 2 and then using complex math to settle on the main chain where energy is needed to process a transaction through mining. I won't get into too much detail on that, but it's very interesting, and the main point is that development in this space is rapid and rampant, and it's another reason why it's very difficult to predict future energy use. There are other chains which I should mention that are built specifically for energy use cases, such as the Energy Web Foundation's Energy Web Chain, which uses proof of authority. So for, yes, last slide, please. So moving forward, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, the exploding growth in energy consumption from this nascent industry can be seen as a threat or an opportunity. I've just covered a small sliver of the developments happening, which are making these chains more energy efficient through scaling. To put this in context, and to show that we simply cannot extrapolate future energy use by using historical data. We need to adopt effective strategies from similar industries to ensure proof of work mining becomes fully sustainable as soon as possible. We don't have time to waste when it comes to achieving our climate goals. The added attention this space affords can be used as a catalyst to achieve a 100% share of renewables in the power sector, making cryptocurrency mining a potential accelerator as opposed to a roadblock of an energy transition centered around renewables. So before I hand over to Francisco for a few final thoughts, I would just like to mention that as we continue to study this space, we're always looking to learn from experts in the field who are building out this tech. So please do reach out to us if you have any comments on what you've seen today, or if you have information that influence our future work on the topic. Again, the pace of development is light speed, so we're trying to keep our finger on the pulse. And if you think we missed any important considerations, please do let us know. Francisco, if you had any other final points before we move to the Q&A, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sean. I think for due to the time constraints, let's move to the Q&A. So back to you, Martina. Next slide, please. So we have the contact details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Sean. A timely, very timely topic with a lot of insights. Yes, we are running a little bit out of time, but due to a lot of questions, we hope you can stay with us for additional maximum 10 minutes to try to answer 5-6 questions we received from you. Let me go directly to them. So maybe I will start with this one to Sean. Instead of making crypto mining more efficient, why not outlaw it completely, since we are at portas or at the door of a climate disaster? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's something we see quite often on Twitter and other places. So essentially, it would be extremely impractical, if not impossible, to ban a decentralized peer-to-peer network spread over the globe. In fact, this is really the main benefit of Bitcoin. It's robust censorship resistance. So this would perhaps force mining underground, reducing the hash rates, making it practical for miners to use more expensive or dirtier sources of electricity. Again, as I mentioned, right now, proof of work mining is about 40% renewables, which is higher than the average. And we should also note that proof of work mining has enabled some benefits to society. So maybe it shouldn't be something that's outright banned, but really we need to study it, make sure it's sustainable. And a more practical approach might be to accept that this technology is here to stay. It will continue to grow, but we need to ensure that our power sectors shift completely to 100% renewables and to leverage the distributed and flexible nature of these new loads to accelerate this shift.
Thank you, Sean. One from Francisco, maybe there, yeah. Do we have to be afraid of the IT in the renewable energy future? Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. No, I don't think we should be scared about it and the use and demand from ICT. I think that this has to be seen as an opportunity. And what we have seen is that a combination of energy efficiency and renewables may help to address the consumption in that area. Going back to data centers, for example, We have seen that between 2010 and 2018, the output from data centers has increased more than sixfold, while the electricity demand from those data centers has increased only in 6%. So of course, information and technology companies are in the core of innovating on how better use and be more efficient, because at the end of the day, it's related to the revenues and profits. So it's amazing how the sector is increasing the efficiency. And on the other hand, as Sean explained, there are approaches on how to make the link to renewables, moving new or allocating new data centers in locations with abundant and very cheap renewable electricity, using waste heat to connect it to district heating systems. Again, the use of their own digital technologies and machine learning, for example, to optimize their processes. So all of that could become, instead of a roadblock, an opportunity for the energy transition. So it's just an issue of how we want to do it, in the wrong way or in a smart way. And I think that we are seeing is good signs to move into the smart way of doing things.
Thank you, Francisco. You partly answer other questions. So I will now move to Sean. There are a lot of them about mining and so on. So there is one, besides the financial sector, where do we see the most relevant use cases for blockchain?
Yeah, this is a good question, and something that we worked on in 2018 and 19 for our report, and Francisco had a slide on this. There are many interesting use cases, from increasing the efficiency and transparency of supply chain management, ensuring things like medicines and baby formula are authentic is already happening, as well as identity management in the developing world, and providing the most vulnerable among us a tool to prove who they are and where they're from. For more information on these topics, UNICEF's Innovation Lab is doing a lot of good work on blockchain, and they talk about a lot of this stuff. In terms of us, in use cases in the energy sector, tracking of renewable energy certificates and guarantees of origin seem like a very interesting use case, which is seeing some traction in the near term. Singapore Power, one of our partners we work with on some of our work, a few years ago established a renewable energy certificate marketplace, which was one of the world's first blockchain-powered marketplaces for the transaction of renewable certificates. And basically what it does is it aims to reduce friction, allowing for smaller power producers to sell their credit on the open market, helping to subsidize increased small-scale renewable adoption. And lastly, project financing is another interesting example. The Sun Exchange in South Africa is basically crowdfunding new solar projects by letting contributors globally contribute, covering the upfront capital costs of the installation and earning monthly income in Bitcoin or local currency based on the power production of the system. So these are just some of the interesting use cases, and I know in our team here we aim to produce more work in the future as the sector develops.
Thank you, Sean. And about other uses, there is a question about how about NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens, which is currently being used by artists. How can they be decarbonized?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic, which is very much in the news right now with these auctions taking place. So essentially what they do, for those who don't know, is that NFTs enable digital creators to really monetize their work in ways that wasn't before possible. So not to single out any specific decentralized application, but one that is really growing right now is Immutable X. So it's a layer 2 solution built on Ethereum, which uses zero knowledge proofs, some very complicated mathematics. But basically, it can reduce energy usage by 99.99%, again, by using some complex mathematics and processing transactions off-chain and then settling on the main chain. So essentially keeping the security of the larger blockchain, but minimizing the energy usage. Their founder has also promised to purchase carbon offsets for the remaining carbon that they do produce via power usage, which again is quite minimum. So there already exists a very efficient solution for minting these NFTs. And again, the space continues to develop and grow at lightning speed. So the main point here is that L2 solutions based on top of chains like Ethereum are already an order of magnitude more efficient than layer 1 solutions. And the pace of innovation is very, very exciting. And we look forward to seeing in the next year or two when this big open chain really moves to proof of stake as well, further limiting or reducing energy usage. So main point, there's a lot of development happening, and we look forward to see what happens next.
Thank you. One question for you and one question for Francisco, and then we will close the Q&A. So, Sean, is there a correlation between energy efficiency, mining, and overall mining performance? If you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Sure. So after the initial hardware capital costs, the energy usage is really the main operational cost for miners. So efficiency is everything, and miners are quite sensitive to price, which is why they traditionally operate in areas with the cheapest electricity, such as Xinjiang province in China, where about 30% of the Bitcoin hash rate is located, again, according to Cambridge, which is awash in hydropower. So we see this trend continuing, using more and more efficient mining equipment and locating to areas with cool climates to reduce cooling needs, and utilizing the ample supply of renewables, again, sort of following what data centers have been doing over the past decades. We really see that as a model and something that can be mimicked by this new burgeoning sector. So I personally think that there are a lot of opportunities, and I'm hopeful, but again, we need to ensure that we follow this path, this sustainable path, and use the best sectors that have done this already as guidance.
Thank you, Sean. And let's close this with the question for Francisco. If you can, Francisco, elaborate more about how you see that energy consumption from information technologies may become an enabler of the energy transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. Yeah, well, what we see is that, first of all, the consumption of these data centers and ICT technologies should come mainly from renewables. And there is a big opportunity also for these data centers to be located, again, in locations with abundant and very low-cost renewable electricity, and also with cold climates, because that will give them availability to very cheap electricity and also reduce the requirement for energy for cooling systems. Secondly, the waste heat from these data centers can be used also to be injected in district heating systems, which will reduce also the consumption of fossil fuels for this application of heating in residential areas or commercial areas. Another possibility as well is the use of local batteries, big large-scale batteries, which can act as buffers to manage peak loads from these data centers. I think Google, for example, is already moving in that direction, and for that, the appropriate regulatory measures to compensate and monetize such services provided to the electricity grid can help to even foster this business model even more. But all in all, I think the key issue is also, as Sean mentioned, energy efficiency. So to continue to improve the efficiency on how these data centers operate, on how all these applications function. So at the end, we will have a system that is more efficient, but also incorporate or help to integrate more renewables in the power system. That is the role of all these new technologies in the energy transition.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Sean. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. Thank you for staying with us for additional almost 15 minutes. So let me thank again Mr. Francisco Boschel and Mr. Sean Radka for sharing with us key takeaways from their work on digitalization, cryptocurrency, and the relationship with renewables and energy efficiency. If you have any comments or questions, you can use the email which was shared on the previous slide. It will be also included in the slides, which we'll share with you in the follow-up email. And also equally, thank you all for listening and for your question and for joining us. We just want to leave you with a few final announcements. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sharing with you a link to a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar. And also the link will be shared in the follow-up email, and we just want to thank you in advance for completing it. We are lining up several other webinars. We will be posting them on the website in the coming days, so please stay tuned. And that is all from us for today. Once again, thank to our speaker, Francisco and Sean, and also to all of you for joining us and for all your questions and the interest. We look forward to seeing you in our next webinar, and by then, goodbye and see you soon.